Imagine this. You wake up one morning and, for the first time in a long time, you decide not to respond. No message, no call, no explanation. You don't defend your silence. You don't apologize for needing space. You simply choose to stop being available. And suddenly, everything shifts. Not because you walked away, but because you removed something they were never grateful for. Your constant presence. You weren't just helpful. You were accessible. Always. To everyone. All the time. You became the one they leaned on. The one who absorbed the mess, smoothed the conflict, and made things easier. Even when it broke you inside. You called it love, loyalty, maturity. But in truth, it was survival. You gave yourself away piece by piece, hoping someone might finally see you whole. But they didn't see you. They saw your function. And what is always within reach eventually becomes invisible. So when you go quiet, not with anger, but with clarity, the illusion collapses. The chaos starts to shake. They don't know what to do without your reaction. Your silence becomes louder than all the noise you used to hold. And for you, that silence becomes sacred. You stop explaining. You stop proving. You stop managing other people's storms while yours rages unattended. And in that quiet, something unfamiliar rises. The first flicker of who you were before you were needed. But before you can reclaim that self, you have to understand something deeper, something darker. You didn't become this available by chance. Somewhere along the way, you were taught that being loved meant being useful. That attention was earned through obedience. That safety came from pleasing, from giving, from disappearing into what others wanted you to be. That lie didn't start yesterday, and it won't be broken without a fight. And yet, the question remains, why did you ever believe that being needed was the same as being loved? They never had to ask. You offered yourself before they even knew what they needed. You adapted, softened, predicted discomfort before it surfaced, and volunteered to carry it. Not because anyone made you, but because you were trained to. Somewhere early on, without words, the lesson landed. Be helpful, be good, be agreeable, or risk being forgotten. And so, without resistance, you made yourself easy to love. You smiled instead of spoke. You apologized when it wasn't your fault. You became what was needed, even when it broke you in ways no one could see. You weren't praised for being whole. You were praised for being manageable. So you learned to read rooms before you read your own emotions. You offered stability, even while you crumbled in silence. You didn't call it fear. You called it maturity, loyalty, compassion. But really, it was survival. You gave more than you had because the idea of being unwanted hurt more than the fatigue ever could. Carl Jung called this the persona, the mask we create to belong. It's not deception, it's protection. You wear it to avoid rejection. You wear it to be accepted, to be chosen. But wear it long enough, and you forget where the mask ends and you begin. You became the caretaker, the fixer, the one who holds space. But who holds space for you? The truth is, you kept giving so they wouldn't leave. You offered silence in place of boundaries, smiles in place of truth. You hoped if you were needed enough, they would finally stay. But they didn't stay for you. They stayed for the part of you that served them. And every time you said yes while your body said no, every time you swallowed truth to protect their comfort, every time you explained yourself for having limits, you weren't being kind. You were disappearing. This isn't about blame. This is about seeing clearly. Because no matter how much you offer, it will never be enough to feel chosen if you're choosing everyone but yourself. You've mistaken being needed for being loved, and the two are not the same. The mask has worked. It kept you safe. It got you this far. But now, it's cracking. It's heavy. And something inside you knows. The version of you that survived is not the version that will make you whole. But seeing the mask is just the beginning. What comes next is harder, because now you have to look at what this performance has truly cost you. Not in moments, but in identity. When you've spent years being available for everyone else, it becomes difficult to recognize your own reflection. So before you step into anything new, you must ask, what did my availability cost me? And who am I when I am no longer performing? You've asked the question now. What did it cost me? What has all this availability, all this readiness, all this saying yes, actually taken from me? And as the question echoes in your chest, something quiet begins to surface. A kind of grief you didn't know had a name. Because the truth is, being constantly available didn't just make you tired, it made you forget who you are. You adapted so often, so quickly, and so completely that your sense of self slowly faded into the background. You stopped checking in with your own needs because someone else always needed you first. You stopped listening to your gut because pleasing them felt safer than trusting yourself. You dismissed your discomfort as selfishness. You ignored your intuition and called it maturity. And over time, your identity became shaped not by desire, but by demand. You didn't make choices. You managed other people's reactions. You didn't feel peace. You felt temporary relief when no one was upset. You became reactive, not because you're emotional, but because you've lived in a constant state of energetic survival. Carl Jung believed the psyche runs on energy, a limited resource like electricity. Every thought, every emotion, every response you give consumes psychic fuel. But what happens when you spend that energy trying to be acceptable to everyone? You burn through it, not in fire, but in silence, not in pain, but in numbness. You feel exhausted even after rest. You feel drained even in stillness. And it's not because you're weak. It's because your soul has been on call for too long. When your identity is built on availability, your worth becomes conditional. You become a tool, a charger, a comfort dispenser. You don't even notice it happening until one day you realize you no longer know what it feels like to exist without being useful. But it goes deeper than fatigue. This availability changes your reality. You begin to feel guilty for resting. You feel anxious when someone doesn't approve. You start second-guessing your boundaries because you've spent your life overriding them. You lose the ability to distinguish between kindness and codependency, between connection and obligation. You begin to confuse being needed with being valued. And slowly, almost invisibly, the world starts to treat you the way you treat yourself. Not as a person, but as a function. You feel invisible, not because people don't see you, but because they only see the version of you that makes their lives easier. You become afraid to say no, not because you lack strength, but because your nervous system has been trained to anticipate rejection the moment you assert yourself. And the moment you do pull back, even gently, you feel the backlash. They call you distant, cold, selfish, not because you are, but because you're no longer serving the role they assigned to you. You're not reacting anymore, and that scares them. Because people who benefit from your lack of boundaries will always interpret your healing as an attack. But it's not just about them. It's about you, about how this way of living, this chronic, internalized pressure to be emotionally available, has pulled you away from your own center. You've become so busy managing other people's chaos that your own stillness now feels threatening. You've been surviving off of borrowed identity for so long that silence now feels like a void rather than a mirror. But what if the void is where your true self has been waiting? What if that discomfort is not the absence of connection, but the return of authenticity? You see, this is the invisible cost no one talks about. Chronic availability is a slow erasure of the self. Not dramatic, not loud. Just a quiet dissolving of boundaries, instincts, and truths. Until the only version of you that remains is the one that keeps others comfortable. And that's the tragedy. But it's also the opening. Because once you see this, truly see it, you can no longer pretend not to. You can no longer pretend that the life you've built on overfunctioning is sustainable. You can't unknow the ways you've been manipulated. You can't unfeel the weight of always being emotionally on. And once the mask slips, once the illusion breaks, a new question emerges, even louder than the last. If I am no longer willing to play this role, what does it actually mean to take my energy back? It doesn't start with a dramatic declaration. It starts in silence, in the pause between impulse and action, in the moment where someone expects your usual yes, and you breathe instead, not to explain, not to soften, just to feel what you actually want. It begins when you finally allow that whisper inside you to speak louder than their expectations. The revolution doesn't come with rage. It comes with remembering. Remembering that your time is not a currency, that your presence is not a product, that your worth was never supposed to be negotiated through exhaustion. You begin to reclaim yourself in pieces. Small refusals, subtle boundaries, choosing not to answer right away, letting a phone ring, leaving a message unread, sitting with the discomfort of not being everything to everyone. And yes, it feels terrifying at first, because for so long, you equated availability with love. But love that requires your disappearance is not love. It's consumption. They may call it selfish when you begin to withdraw, but that's only because they got used to the version of you that forgot how to say no. But withdrawal is not abandonment. It's an act of sacred return. Carl Jung called it individuation, the process of becoming whole. Not the version of you they trained, not the persona you've perfected, but the self beneath the performance. And the truth is, most people don't want to meet that version of you because it's no longer as controllable, no longer as compliant, no longer willing to fill in the gaps of their emptiness. So they will push back. They'll guilt you. They'll say you've changed. They'll say you're cold. But what they really mean is, you're no longer playing the role they cast you in. And that's when you must decide. Will you abandon yourself again just to be accepted? Or will you stand there, still and whole, even if it means being misunderstood? You reclaim your energy when you stop defending your boundaries, when you let your silence be enough, when you realize that you do not owe anyone access to you just because they've grown used to taking. And slowly, something begins to shift. The people who were only attached to your availability begin to fall away. Conversations grow quieter. Invitations slow down. Your phone doesn't light up as much. At first, it feels like loss. But it's not. It's clarity. You are watching the roles dissolve, the false intimacy evaporate. You're witnessing in real time who was with you and who was simply with your function. You're not becoming cruel. You're becoming clear. And in that clarity, you begin to breathe again. For the first time in years, maybe decades, you feel a space inside you open. A space that used to be filled with performance, noise, management. Now it's just stillness, just breath, just you. And this is where power returns, quiet, unshakable. Not the kind that needs to be proven, but the kind that simply is. You are no longer asking for respect. You are embodying it. You are no longer begging to be seen. You are seeing yourself. You are no longer reacting to the world. You are now choosing how and when to engage with it. Because presence, when it's not demanded, becomes magnetic. You no longer exist to soothe discomfort, resolve crisis, or prove your goodness. You exist to live, fully, freely, authentically. And it's in this space, this strange, sacred quiet, that something new begins to emerge. Not just peace, not just strength, something deeper, a new self. But with this emergence comes one final reckoning. Because even in your clarity, even in your power, there is one final test. The loneliness, the isolation that follows liberation, the echo that lingers when you finally leave the stage. And the question that waits for you in the silence, like a shadow on the wall: if this is who I am when I no longer perform, can I bear to be alone with it? So you're here now, not just physically, but emotionally stripped, spiritually bare. You've said no. You've let go. You've watched the roles fall away like dust. And what remains is silence. At first, it's deafening. You notice the absence of messages, of invitations, of people who once clung to your light. You feel the stillness where chaos used to live. The space that was once filled with obligations is now empty, and the emptiness feels unbearable. Not because it's wrong, but because it's unfamiliar. This silence isn't punishment, it's detox. You've spent years being a source for others. Now, with nothing pulling at you, you finally hear the hum of your own existence. And it's quieter than you thought it would be. No one prepares you for this part. The ache, the doubt, the voice inside that whispers, maybe I went too far. Maybe I was better off being needed. But that voice isn't truth. It's habit. A familiar echo from a former life. Because you're not being rejected, you're being refined. Carl Jung said we do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And this is the darkness. Not evil, not pain, but the absence of distraction. The rawness of being with yourself without applause, without mirrors, without roles. At first, the loneliness cuts deep. You question if you were ever truly loved or just used. You replay conversations, scroll through silence, try to trace where the connections frayed. But the further you go into that quiet, something else begins to awaken, something beneath the grief. You start to notice a new kind of strength. Not loud, not sharp, just there. It's in the way you breathe slower, the way you no longer rush to respond, the way you sit with discomfort, not because it's easy, but because it's real. The peace isn't perfect. It wavers, but it's yours. And that makes all the difference. You no longer perform. You no longer chase. You no longer shapeshift to stay relevant in someone else's story. You are not accessible, and in that rarity, you become powerful. Not because you are distant, but because you are rooted, present, whole. You begin to realize those who left were never truly with you. They were with your compliance, your function, your capacity to absorb what they didn't want to face. But now that you're no longer available, their reflection is broken, and they have nothing to bounce off of but their own emptiness. And you've stopped trying to be understood by people who were never willing to see beyond their own needs. You've stopped proving your worth. You've stopped bleeding for approval. You don't explain your absence anymore. It explains itself. And the ones who were never meant to stay fade. Not with cruelty, just with truth. Because the closer you get to your essence, the fewer people can follow. But that's the point. You are not here to be a mirror. You are not here to be useful. You are not here to be available on command. You are here to become whole. And that wholeness comes at a price. The price is solitude, misunderstanding, the ache of walking alone through the threshold of your own transformation. But on the other side of that ache is freedom. Not the kind that screams, the kind that radiates. You speak less, but your presence says more. You smile slower, but it's real. You hold your own gaze now, and for the first time, you don't flinch. This is who you were before the world told you who to be. Not what they loved you for, not what they needed you for, but who you are, without transaction. You have returned, not louder, but clearer, not softer, but sovereign, not broken, but finally, undeniably whole.